In one of his most appealing portraits with a young girl with the mink, it sort of duplicates, but in a more sensitive way, the Mona Lisa, which seems sort of strained and overworked. This one has a freshness or an alive quality. She's a very fashionable lady. The eyebrows are plucked, the hair is plucked back to form a high forehead, a typical Da Vinci face with the smooth oval quality of the head structure. The eyebrows are where they were, but the brow bone following down into a fairly long, nice straight nose, and then that deep set mouth that forms dark shadows at its corners. The hair is pulled in a knot underneath the cheek and at the chin in the fashion of the time, and she's very elaborately dressed. The mink was a symbol of the family, not a family pet by any means, but he used it as a symbol of the family tree. Beautiful presentation of the hand. Slide, please. In other portraits that he did, fairly formalized things, he was called upon to do these things. But most of the times he would be devising war implements and battle fortifications for the Duke of Milan as these different Italian principalities would be warring against one another. Finally, out of political power, he moved to France and worked for King Louis for a while, and then finally settling at Amboise at a chateau there, died and is buried in France. Slide, please. Da Vinci was sort of the turning point between the early Renaissance and the late Renaissance, where I had mentioned he used this massive one-point perspective to achieve this tremendous depth, this feeling of monumentality, which of course sacrifices movement. And in this composition, which of course is just basically a composition left, it's been so overworked in such a horrible state of repair, but the fresco of the Last Supper, and it's not true fresco, this is why most of it is flaked off the walls, but he embodies the transition between early 15th century and late 15th century, where he uses the interior of the room in this strong one-point perspective that unifies the whole organization, and then in the groups of figures of the apostles, where he has taken the dramatic moment that when Christ says, "One of you will betray me," all the activity in the movement in the groups of figures speaks of the coming Baroque period of the 17th century, of the 1600s. You start to begin to get movement within the Renaissance paintings, but of course the more movement you have, you sacrifice the monumental effect. And it was this transition of this pivot painting here. Slide, please. Da Vinci painted over a period of time, not adhering to true fresco techniques, and the wall was damp, painting mostly in tempera rather than true fresco staining. Most of it is chipped away. It was considered lost for a century or two, and then finally they have restored it. The last restoration was in 1958. About 1% of the original surface remains. The rest has been repainted by other restorers, except the basic composition still remains and is Da Vinci's. Slide, please. Slide, please. His masterpiece, and probably becomes too famous for its own good, is the Mona Lisa. She has faded away. Da Vinci was always experimenting with his paints and techniques, and as a result, maybe in another 50 or 100 years, the Mona Lisa will no longer exist. She's just sort of a brown, faded glory of her famous past. Slide, please. He did this large composition many times over, the Madonna. This one was St. Anne, again using the pyramidal group. And you seem to have sort of a pasted effect of the frontal plane of the picture and then his typical landscape in the background. Slide, please. His modeling is so beautiful, the blending of paints, that photographs taken of his paintings enlarged 4 times can still not detect a brush stroke. Slide, please. In one of his last paintings, that of St. John, was in a very very bad state of repair. He was being used as a tabletop in one period when somebody finally rediscovered it, and through restoration has brought out somewhat of its former glory. Slide, please.
The four artists that we've had so far this semester are very different. They cover a span of about 150 years. The first one was Giotto, G-I-O-T-T-O. He was early 14th century, 1336 he died. He was the first one to introduce humanism as subject matter, to make the people human, to draw from nature rather than a stylized pattern. He had the blue background, the flat plattered halo stuck on behind the person's head, sort of fluorescent lighting, no direct light. He did have shadows, but you really didn't know where the light was coming from. There was a general lighting. And he had simplification of drapery. They weren't wrinkles, but they were folds. They were carefully designed, usually to lead your eye to the important part of the composition. Slide, please. All right, the second artist was about 100 years later, 1400 to 1428, Masaccio, M-A-S-A-C-C-I-O. He introduced quite a few things. Atmosphere by blurring things off in the distance, making things sharp and clear up close. He also discovered perspective, although it isn't a true thing, perspective, but his halos were discs that floated up above the artist's head. He obviously knew anatomy, understanding of the working of the human body. And he also introduced a constant light source, that the light came from one source and always was complete or continuing in that composition. So the light is on one side, the shadow on the other side. Slide, please. Then even later, in the 1500s, you have Sandro Botticelli, B-O-T-T-I-C-E-L-L-I. And he was one of the first painters that produced secular or non-religious subject, going back to mythology. A really true Renaissance painter after they rediscovered classicism in ancient Rome. His paintings resemble the wet drapery of late Greek Hellenistic sculpture, where the flowing robes, even though they're very patterned and beautiful, but the robes cling to expose the shape of the figure beneath them. Very decorative. A more light color palette, using white more to make the colors more opaque rather than transparent. But very decorative. The canvases are filled. He does know perspective, and you can always sort of trace the lines of his buildings or the thrones or the architectural assemblages within his compositions to the exact vanishing point. At this time, only one-point perspective would be used because it would show infinity, the vastness of space on a small surface. Slide. And then Leonardo da Vinci, D-A-V-I-N-C-I, a master of the Renaissance. It's his Last Supper that was the transition painting from the 1500s into the 1600s. More movement, where you lack the monumentality, but you have a lot more action and activity within his compositions, his later compositions. Vasari, a historian at the time, said that Da Vinci built his paintings, his skin up, cell by cell. Beautiful, so translucent, transparent glazes, transparent washes on top of one another, finally building up to the surface. Absolutely meticulous painting detail. His stylization or characteristic was the oval face, the plucked eyebrows, the plucked hairline, a fairly long nose ending in a deep-set mouth. Very oval face. Slide, please. Clear the machine.
May I have your attention, please? This tape is on Michelangelo and Raphael. Put in the first slide, please.
Michelangelo was the giant of the Renaissance. Solitary genius whose fame spread over the peninsula of Italy during the latter part of the 15th century and well into famous artistic people of the city of Florence in front of the Uffizi Gallery. Slide, please. Michelangelo started at a very early age, becoming familiar with the rock quarries that his father worked in at the early age of 5, playing around the large marble deposits of the gray stones that surround the city of Florence. His talent was obvious from the very first, and at the age of 14 was apprenticed to the school of Lorenzo de' Medici within the gardens. Within the gardens, he had a chance of seeing the classical antiquity sculpture that the Medicis had collected, a chance of working with the masters of the Medici home, and also living within the Medici palace, being treated as a son. The earliest known object, that of a faun, has been lost and never discovered by Michelangelo, although within writing it was known that he created a sleeping faun at about the age of 15. Another very early piece, built in the time of Lorenzo de' Medici, who died when Michelangelo was 17, is called the Madonna of the Steps. And even in this, it shows a power for a youth to have created such a piece out of the hard Carrara marble that Michelangelo liked to work in most of his lifetime. In the bas-relief, which is, it gives the illusion of depth, but within a fairly flat surface, and the side lighting tends to deepen the crevices in this, you have a feeling of a reality, a handling of the drape, and also an influence of the classical sculpture that he worked around and was influenced by. A classic feeling of the sculpture, but an introduction of a human quality, which was the essence of the Renaissance in Florence, humanism, within the figures. Slide, please. He became friends with the prelate at the Church of Santa Spirito, where he later in his life did dissections on corpses. But he carved for him a pair of fairly large marble candlestick holders of angels. He's a fairly academic, still within the classical range, but an ambitious project for one so young. Slide, please. And an early Cupid that has been damaged over the years, and it's not too good a condition. In fact, the head may be by another sculptor, and not by Michelangelo, because the head has been replaced at a later date. Even a statue as great as the David that we'll see later on has been damaged one time or another, but of course has been repaired. When Lorenzo de' Medici died, when Michelangelo was 17, there was a great turmoil within the political regime of Florence, and the turnover in power forced Michelangelo on his first trip to Rome. There he received his first commission, a large standing Bacchus, but fairly well established his reputation in his early, late teens and early 20s. Slide, please. There was also another bas-relief of this very early period of the battling men. And this was supposedly a sketch for a much more ambitious project that was to be presented to him later on in a commission. The volume of Michelangelo's work is fantastic. It would seem that the man would have to have worked 20 hours a day, and it is known that on many of his projects, when he became involved in some of the more complicated ones, that his working day was 20 hours or sometimes straight through, and then falling exhausted on his bed would sleep for 2 or 3 days. He would work at night with a candle attached to sort of a visor on his cap and chisel away using both right and left hand. Slide, please. This is one in color of the marble of the same bas-relief for the battling man. It is not large. It is only about 4 feet tall, so the figures are on a miniature scale. But the complexity of all the figures intertwined within this bas-relief, it really makes it a masterwork. Slide, please. His first great masterpiece, and probably one of the greatest pieces of art in the world today, is his Pietà that he carved between the ages of 23 and 25. It was commissioned for St. Peter's in Rome by a French cardinal. And Michelangelo devised the scheme of the Madonna holding the dead Christ in her arms, that is to go in a niche in St. Peter's in a small chapel, so that the backside, that you very seldom see, is more or less blocked out in such nice abstract geometric form. But Michelangelo did much preliminary work. He knew stone, and he felt that in selecting the block of marble for the piece of sculpture, that it was only his duty to chip away the excess stone, that the piece of sculpture he envisioned lay already within the block of marble. He hired models to come pose for sketches, something he very seldom did later in his life, working from memory or imagination. He bought yards of the cheap material and dipped it into sort of the muddy banks of the Tiber, and then draped it across forms to see how the material would flow naturally or fall into shape, so that when he did work in marble, the structure would hold up the piece. Then he would pose these men within the framework of this mock-up of the mud-dried cloth and do the sketches, and then they would get the idea after the first few sketches of what they were posing for. He kept the figure of the Madonna fairly young, because he said a woman of such purity would never grow old. And he minimized the body of the Christ, smaller in scale, to sort of show still the sun quality, the baby that she held in her arms, the last, the mother and child, actually still reverting back to the original beginning. Slide, please. The piece is highly refined, as he did most of his work in the early years. His first, he did many clay and wax models in scale, usually about 18 inches. And then he worked up a clay model in full scale, which of course has been lost. We know these facts through notes that Michelangelo kept in his diaries. But then in chipping away at the marble, it is worked with a fairly rough, coarse chisel with teeth on it, chipping away the excess. And then as you get down to the form itself, you use a flat chisel, flat-edged chisel, and then finally in the polishing, which took him 6 months on this piece, he worked 2 years on it, including the preparation. Pumice would grind the marble down to a beautifully smooth surface. It gives it this sort of sheen, this oily sheen. It is a very complicated affair, but has great sympathy to it. Slide, please. The figure of Christ with the delicately carved beard and the flow of the hair, but a serene look under the dead body. Slide, please. And one of the very few statues that Michelangelo ever carved of a woman that actually had a very feminine and soft quality to it. Later on, as we'll see, especially in the Medici chapel, the women were very muscular and masculine looking. But with the Pietà, there's a softness to the work of Michelangelo. Slide, please. And it is the only fine piece by Michelangelo that we have. The story goes, one day he was, after he had been placed in St. Peter's, he overheard the family sort of arguing as to the origin of the piece, and the work being attributed to many different artists. That evening, with his little green bag holding his tools and the candle to go on the visor on his cap, he went back into St. Peter's, and in a band that encircled the Virgin's chest, he inscribed in the cut, Michelangelo of Florence made this. Slide, please. Michelangelo is mainly a sculptor, and there are very few paintings. There are many drawings and many sketches. In this one we have sort of the Baroque manner of the Mannerist school, which goes into the 16th century, where color is accentuated to sort of an intensity. The figures, you have a feeling of motion and movement, as you would in all of Michelangelo's work. You have a feeling of a tremendous volume, the heaviness of the figure. And here you have the Holy Family in a tondo, or a secular portrait, with nudes scattered in the background. The feeling of the drapery of being much like the Hellenistic Greek period. The figures themselves, classic in origin, and sort of massive in their monumental effect. Slide, please. Michelangelo's great masterpiece, along with the Pietà of his early period, is the David. It was carved originally for the Piazza Signori outside the Ducal Palace in Florence. But after a bench was thrown from the tower and knocked off the arm during one battle of the siege of the city, the statue was finally removed and repaired and placed in the safety of the Accademia in Florence. As you enter the Accademia, you look down the long corridor lined with late Michelangelo works of his unfinished Bound Slave series, with rich tapestries forming a background. And then down toward the end of the corridor, underneath the domed skylight, you see the massive giant figure of David, carved from a single piece of marble, also taking 2 years of its lifetime, between 28 and 30. The piece of stone was owned by the city of Florence and had been chiseled on at one point by a minor sculptor, sort of gouged in the center. It had lain dormant for about 50 years when finally the city commissioned Michelangelo to do this figure of David. It is a massive thing, 13 feet tall from feet to top of head, and the base that it stands on, bringing it 18 feet from the floor level. You get an idea of the scale of it when you start at the bottom. Slide, please. With the figures of the two men standing down in the lower section, and then as you go up, slide, please, to the massive head, approximately 2 feet tall, you catch a human expression in this. The look of David about to go out and slay the giant. You have the worry of the furrowed brow. It is still classic in pose, but there's a human quality, there's an emotion within this figure that you would have never found in classic sculpture. Michelangelo worked from, again, clay models, and finally figured out where the statue lay within the block of marble. And it was at an angle from tip to tip on a bias. He had a scaffolding built out in the open and a tarpaulin to cover the opening during the cold winter months. And he started sculpturing on the large block of stone. Around the block, he had scaffolding built so that boards could be put at any angle as he crawled up to chip away the stone. Slide, please. He then, as he worked over the long period of time, left webbing between the legs to support the figure and between the arms, as the uplifted left arm holds the sling that slides down across his back and to the large rock that is held in the right hand on the relaxed side of the body. A tree stump then also supports the legs of the figures, and right until toward the very end of the piece of sculpture that he then removed the webbing or the supports between the legs to absolutely free the figure. Slide, please. The relaxed hand is so cupped under that you can't see the large stone that's held in the arm. But the beauty of hands, the veins, the detailing. Slide, please. Another one of the massive projects that was presented for Michelangelo was a tomb for Pope Julius, the warring pope that beleaguered Michelangelo all of his lifetime. Michelangelo was upset with a very problem family that demanded his time and his money, and also by the commissions. He never refused to commission, and the work piled up with a monumental amount for a man's lifetime. The tomb of Pope Julius was supposed to be a monumental effect of something like 42 pieces of sculpture included within the monument. But plans changed and the whole project dwindled until you see the facade and the one main piece of sculpture, that of Moses. Slide, please. This powerful figure, about 8 feet tall, the seated figure of Moses, that shows all the power within the man from the Old Testament. Historians feel that at this point, Michelangelo is becoming into the Baroque period. The treatment of the beard, some swirling around, the treatment of the drapery over the lifted knee. There's a massiveness to Michelangelo's work, an interaction, of motion, an energy that's about to explode in all of the pieces. Slide, please. It was also Pope Julius who summoned him to Rome to decorate the interior of the Sistine Chapel. The ceiling had been painted at an earlier date in just a plain color, and there are other frescoes that have been painted along the lower areas within the chapel by Botticelli, Perugino, and even one earlier one by Michelangelo on the end wall. He conceived this pattern of large architectural details along the spandrels or the side walls of this broad ceiling, and then working within areas squared off, worked from the back end of the chapel, as you see it now, working from the flood back to the altar end of the chapel, which was the creation. He devised a series of scaffolding that reached to 67 feet from floor to top of ceiling that covered half of the chapel. And then when he finished that half, it was torn down and moved to the other end of the building. His style also loosened as he progressed. He was going to have helpers to work out his compositions, but he fired them all within the first few weeks, feeling them incompetent. And with the exception of the men who came in and plastered the area for the fresco to be painted each day, he completed the entire 10,000 square feet of ceiling, comprising 342 figures, anywhere from 10 to 18 feet in length by himself over a 4-year period. Slide, please. As you look directly up to the ceiling, we will see it in 3 slides. From the creation, slide, please, to the creation of Adam, to the expulsion from the garden, slide, please, and to the flood. The spandrels along the side are of large figures of prophets or sibyls that foretold the coming of Christ. Slide, please. Within this architectural framework, the ceiling holds together. There's a rigid uniformity within these rectangular areas where the compositions then are more or less framed. Slide, please. As you recall, fresco is a very demanding medium. The cartoon is placed on the wall, and the fresco is laid up within the area of the cartoon, pounded to beat the water to the surface. It's allowed to dry for a short period of time where it is still moist but not dry. Then the pigment is placed directly on the plaster, and it soaks in and becomes part of the wall. Slide, please. Within these massive massive figures. You have this movement that foretells the 16th century type of art. One with constant turmoil, emotional quality, a tremendous volume of things moving. Slide, please. And these massive figures just occupying space. Slide, please. And one of the most important frescoes within the chapel, that of the creation of Adam, that you have the massive 18-foot long body of Adam, sort of limp, lifeless, as he reaches his hand out. The cloud with God reaching toward Adam. Slide, please. And the magnetic little space between the two figures as just at the moment where God would touch the hand of Adam and bring life to his body. Slide, please. You now have a series of figures that adorn the rectangular framework. Slide, please. Slide, please. Michelangelo's knowledge of anatomy is absolutely correct. He performed many dissections, which was, of course, illegal at the time, but through friends was able to do it. He exaggerated the human figure into this muscular form, carrying on the Greek ideal of beauty, but bringing it to a human level. The Greeks never portrayed a human other than possibly an athlete, but then only at the time he had reached a godlike level. With Michelangelo, the figures are godlike, but they are human. Slide, please. After the Sistine Chapel, which ruined his health, working many long hours, only on rainy days when the pastor would not set up, he retired to a studio and sketched life-size cartoons on paper to be used within the ceiling. Afterwards, for a period of time, he did not work too much, and then there was this large figure called the Victory that was supposedly found for the tomb of Pope Julius, but was never used there. Slide, please. And then he was commissioned by the Medici family that had befriended him in a very important period of his life to do the chapel or the tomb for Giuliano and Giuliano de' Medici. He was to be attached to the Church of San Lorenzo, where the main area of tombs for the Medici family is found. He conceived this Renaissance structure based on classical motifs, mostly Roman antiquity rather than Greek. And in this you find the use of the classical forms of the pediment or the arched or rounded pediment, the type of pilaster or column that really does not support, but is a decorative addition, as the gray ones with the Corinthian flat caps. And he conceived this whole area using the gray and white marble found near Florence. It is just off on the stairway from the large church, San Lorenzo, and you have a fairly large square room with the altar at one side, and then the two sarcophagi on either side flanking the altar, on the top of which are the figures night and day, and on the opposite side of evening and morning. And then directly above the sarcophagi are portraits of the two Medicis within niches. Slide, please. And then on the opposite end of the wall, you have three pieces of sculpture by Michelangelo that may have been intended for this spot, may not. The central one was a Madonna and Child carved in the gray Florentine marble. Slide, please. The figure on the right-hand side, the museum in Houston has a small terracotta sketch or study of this figure. This is just about at eye level. Slide, please. And the opposite one, a more meditative sketch of Giuliano. and the sarcophagi hold the bodies of the two Medicis. Slide, please. These are glorified and not exact portraits, but as Michelangelo said, in 1,000 years, who would care what they looked like? Slide, please. So these are slightly flattered versions of the two men. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. And the Madonna that is at the opposite end of the altar wall. Slide, please. This is beginning one of the stages of Michelangelo's career where the things were left in a more unfinished stage. Slide, please. The chisel marks, or the fine ones, are left showing how he fired the form of the face from the nose down across the cheek. This has not been polished. He did not intend it to be. Slide, please. He was recalled to Rome 25 years later to decorate the end wall of the Sistine Chapel with a large fresco, the largest area ever covered by fresco, something like 45 by 67 feet, of the Last Judgment. It is within the confines of the compositions normally used of the Last Judgment, with the figure of God passing judgment in the upper section. The figures of those damned falling, as we look at it, to the lower right-hand side, and those ascending into heaven rising up on the left-hand side as we look at it. Slide, please. These are massive figures in motion, some of them beautifully floating in space. The weight of the body, the massiveness of the body seeming to have a completely light, delicate effect. It shows great energy, power, and movement. Slide, please. And this is the people are loaded into the boat crossing the river Styx. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. One here who has just learned he has been damned, being pulled down into hell. Slide, please. The last works of Michelangelo are powerful figures left in the unfinished stage, slaves bound by the rock, half emerged, except just enough so that visually we know where the rest of the figure is within the uncut stone. Slide, please. Michelangelo was well into his 70s when he was working on this series. He worked up until the very last. He lived to be 91. Slide, please. But the feel of the unfinished quality gives these works even more power. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. Slide, please. Into his 60s, this jumps back a little bit, but I think it is a fitting end to Michelangelo, to the slides on Michelangelo. There was a Pietà grouping that he was doing for his own tomb. The figure of Nicodemus at the top of the pyramid was supposed to be a portrait of Michelangelo himself. He was not considered a very handsome man. He had a large broken nose that he received in a fight over a discussion in the church of the Carmen about Masaccio's frescoes with another artist at the time, Tomasino. He had worked on this, which is in gray stone, for a period of time, and then found a flaw in the model and decided to abandon it. It was later sold to another sculptor who finished the figure of Magdalene on the left, refined it, overly refined it, and also the one leg of Christ that's evident within this compositional group. And many times, as in the statue of David, it was carved from one single block. But later on, when more movement was demanded within the sculpture group, pieces of marble would be attached through a peg system. Slide, please. And we see in this where the step of the leg of Christ that would go over the leg of his mother was left unfinished or unattached, and the square hole that was carved into the marble would then be used for the peg to attach the two pieces together. Slide, please. And the magnificence of the portrait of Michelangelo as the figure of Nicodemus. You can see the chisel marks and the power. Slide, please. The second artist is Raphael Sanzio, or known as Raphael, R-A-P-H-A-E-L. His dates were 1483 to 1520. He died on his 37th birthday and is considered the peak of the Italian Renaissance. The epitome, everything led up to Raphael, and from Raphael it went downward. I really can't agree with most historians on the importance of Raphael. He was an eclectic, E-C-L-E-C-T-I-C, which means he borrowed from everybody and sort of meshed it together to form his own style. Historians say that he has a great purity of style. I feel that it's sterile. They say that he gives life to his figures. They seem stilted and static. He does create a great space, and maybe he is the culmination of everything, but it seems a shame to think that the sort of sentimental, sweet Madonna paintings of Raphael would be an end to the greatness of people like Da Vinci and Michelangelo. Slide, please. His early works, we can sort of divide them into about three periods. The early period being the Florentine period, where he was influenced by, his first period by his master Perugino, which classical subject matter or mythology, religious subject matter, but done in sort of a romantic but classic style, crisp edge. And then you have the period of his Madonnas where he was under the influence of Leonardo da Vinci when he was in the city of Florence. He never became great, really, in the city of Florence. Of course, he lived such a short time that it's amazing the place that he made for himself in the history of art in that short period. But, slide please. The Madonna paintings that he did during the period of 1504 to 1508 when he lived in Florence are sort of the culmination of the high Renaissance style. His paintings, I hope that you will notice, are based much on Leonardo's stylization of the faces. There's the oval attitude, there's a great similarity. The addition that Raphael makes is a richness of color. You don't have this sort of dull brown sfumato type painting that Da Vinci did. There's a heavier application of paint, a richness of color. And also there's a little more movement within the space, whereas Leonardo piles his things within a pyramidal form. You start having an interaction or an interplay